All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're happy to be here and hopefully are able to give you some answers to the many questions that you probably have about filing for taxes as non-residents. My name is Dulce Cordova Curry. I am with the Office of International Student and Scholar Affairs. And so we have been receiving a number of your questions. And we received a number of your questions last year, and so we wanted to go ahead and provide this presentation sooner so that you can get some of your questions answered. Joining us today is my colleague, Leah Simmer, and she is going to also be here to answer questions. There is a Q&A chat on the bottom, so feel free to ask your questions there, and we'll address some of the questions as we go. And then really the star of the show is actually Concha Prado, who works for the tax department at Notre Dame. And she is a tax expert, and she is going to be leading this presentation. And so with that, I'll let her introduce herself.
Thank you, Dulce, for the sweet introduction. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I know that there's a lot of demands on your time, but I'm hopeful that this presentation will help address a lot of your questions. Now, I can't promise that I'm going to go into great detail on how specifically you will file, but my hope is to direct you to the right resources so you feel like you have an action plan on what you're going to do next as a result of this presentation. Okay, so with that, we'll get you started with a little baseline on the federal, our presentation on federal taxes for non-resident aliens. I also want to add, as Dulce mentioned, we're going to try to make this as interactive as possible. So submit your Q&As, but I will also note that we won't address any particular situation. So if you have a specific situation that you have a question on, we'll provide you with guidance on where to direct those questions, or feel free to reach out after the presentation is done, as we can't really go into that much detail in this presentation about a particular situation. Okay, so with that, we're getting started. All right, so I'm going to provide you with a tax overview, then I'll go over some common tax forms. I think even us US people can get confused on the many various forms that there are, so I think I'm going to hope that we can straighten them all out so you know what exactly you should be expecting this tax season. I'm going to go over what a status for U.S. tax purpose is and how do you determine it. I'm going to go over briefly on tax treaties, the resources available for tax preparation. I'm going to touch base on a couple of ITIN common questions, and then what if you need additional time to file. We'll go over about how you go about filing an extension, and then I'll just open it up for general questions at the end. Okay, so what about taxes? The United States has a pay-as-you-go, so you won't owe system. So basically, every time you get paid, the Internal Revenue Service, what we call the IRS, they basically want to get a prepayment of tax every single time you get paid. So many of you get paid here by the university, you'll notice that you don't really get your entire paycheck deposited to your account. There are a few withholdings that kind of take place before you end up getting your net pay deposited. So basically, this is called tax withholding. You usually see federal, Indiana, and St. Joseph County tax being withheld from every pay. So what's happening is, you're earning money and you're basically pre-depositing it towards your tax. And then at tax time, you're going to find out really what your specific tax liability is due, and then from there you either get your money back or you have to pay a difference if you didn't pay enough with your withholding. So it's basically broken down different steps. Step one is your tax withholding, as I mentioned.
Concha, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. You sound a little muffled. I wonder if maybe we get closer to the mic.
Is this a little better?
Sorry. That's perfect. Thank you so much. Sorry, proceed.
No problem. Thank you for the feedback.
Thank you.
So, step one is to kind of determine your tax withholdings. So, how much is given to the Internal Revenue Service each pay period depends on what is on your tax withholding election, Form W-4 on Inside and D. All right, there are specific instructions for non-resident aliens. So if you haven't set up your tax withholding elections on Inside and D and you're filing as a non-resident alien, it may be a good exercise to check what your tax withholding elections are on Inside and D. And you can just go into Inside and D and search for tax withholding elections, and you'll be able to set up these elections. If you need the instructions, they'll be linked here in the presentation at the end as a resource for everyone. Okay, so that's what you do. Usually you would set up your withholding elections as soon as you start a job, but you can change them at any point in the year. All right. Then step 2 is at the end of the year, you're going to file a tax return, right? After the end of the year, you would file a tax return. You will receive all your tax forms stating all your income and what has been withheld and paid on your behalf to the Internal Revenue Service. So at that time, you can calculate your tax liability and determine, if you paid too much or if you didn't pay enough. If you paid too much, you can request to get a refund from the Internal Revenue Service. If you didn't pay enough, then you're probably going to have to pay the difference along with your tax return. And then from what you determine on your tax return, it's probably a good idea to make any adjustments for the current calendar year. So if you have to pay a lot out of pocket with your tax return, you want to make adjustments to your tax withholding elections on Inside and D so that you don't have to pay as much next year. Likewise, if you get a lot of money back, you probably also either want to change the withholding elections, or if you have a treaty, you may elect to file the treaty exemption, which I'll cover on later, that will allow you to receive the treaty benefit ahead of time before you file your income tax return. So here's a brief summary on the annual tax file requirements. So if you're a non-resident alien present in the United States, you have a tax obligation to file the appropriate tax forms with the IRS by the tax deadline. The tax deadline is April 15 of 2024. So if you're an F1 or J1 visa holder who was present in the US during the tax year, so in this case, if you were present during 2023 calendar year, if you received income, whether it is that you will receive a Form W-2 or Form 1042-S, you will need to file an income tax return. If you did not receive income, you will just file Form 8843. It's a much simpler return. It's about 2 pages long, and it's just about providing information when you were present. Now, the income tax return is a little more elaborate, and you can file a Form 1040-NR if you're a non-resident alien for U.S. tax purposes, or a Form 1040 if you are a resident alien for U.S. tax purposes. Additional to your federal tax requirement, you may also need to file an Indiana income tax return. The tax return that you file will depend on whether you're considered an Indiana resident, and basically Indiana has stated that they'll go over, they'll use the same residency status for international students as they do for federal. So if you're a non-resident alien for U.S. tax purposes, then you'll be considered a non-resident for Indiana tax purposes. Whereas, like, if you're a resident alien for U.S. tax purposes, you'd be considered a resident of Indiana for Indiana tax purposes. So Indiana has different thresholds depending on whether you file as a resident or a non-resident of Indiana. So residents will only need to file if they have $1,000 or more, whereas non-residents need to file an Indiana tax return if they have any amount of income earned in Indiana. So if you're working here at the university, it is considered Indiana income, and you probably, if you're filing as a non-resident alien, will need to file even if it's under $1,000. Okay, so here we go with some common tax forms. Form W-2 is probably the most popular form. This reports employment income and the related tax withholding. So employment income would also include any stipends that get paid through payroll. I know that sometimes is a confusing point, but usually stipends that are paid through payroll are deemed service related stipends, and so they're categorized as employment income and are reported on Form W-2. If you still have an active Inside ND here with the university, I don't know if any former students might be joining us, but you can download Form W-2 from Inside ND. If you didn't elect to receive it electronically, you will also receive a paper Form W-2 in the mail. But everyone who has an active Inside ND can access their Form W-2 online through Inside ND. The other tax form that you might be receiving from the university is called Form 1042-S. This reports any income paid to a non-resident alien for payments other than employment income. It also reports income that was exempt by treaty. So if you provided the tax department a Form 8233 for the 2023 calendar year, or a Form W-9, or a Form W-8-BEN, all those would then mean that you'll be receiving a Form 1042-S from our department. Additionally, if you received any travel grants from your department during the year, those would also usually be included, as well as any other awards that you may have received during the year would be included in this Form 1042-S. Additionally, if you receive any scholarship that covers room and board, books, or travel, clothing, all that would be included in Form 1042-S. All right. Form 1099 is usually received only by those who file their taxes as resident aliens, and those tend to report other income. You might also, if you have a bank account and you've been earning interest on your bank account, you might be receiving a Form 1099 int from your bank, reporting any interest that you've received for the calendar year. Form 1098-T is required to support anyone claiming an education credit. This form is prepared by the Office of Student Accounts and is available online on Inside ND as well. And then Form 1095-A sometimes is used to reconcile advance payments or claim a premium tax credit. And usually you will receive this form if you use the health insurance marketplace to purchase health insurance. So now I'm going to go over and talk about how do you, what is the status for U.S. tax purpose? There are three statuses for U.S. tax purposes. One is the U.S. citizen or a legal permanent resident. One is a resident alien, and those two are treated the same for tax purposes. They're usually, the IRS usually coins this term, the U.S. person, and they file the same tax return. Now, the third category, the non-resident alien for U.S. tax purposes, they file a different tax form, Form 1040-NR, and different tax rules apply between these two different buckets, right, of taxpayers. Now, I just want you to know that these categories only apply for tax purposes, and they do not determine your immigration status. So even if you get categorized as a resident alien for U.S. tax purposes, this is not the same of saying as the same as a legal permanent resident. So how do you determine what your status for U.S. tax purposes is? Usually it's a test that was designed by the Internal Revenue Service to make this determination, and it's called the substantial presence test. As the name suggests, it really depends on how much U.S. presence in the United States you have had for that calendar year. So in order to meet the test for a specific calendar year, you have to be present for at least 31 days for the current year, and then be physically present for 183 days following kind of like a funky formula that they've created where it counts all of the days that you're present in the current calendar year plus 1/3 of the days in the previous calendar year, and then 1/6 of the days during the second preceding calendar year. So it kind of has a 3-year like look back rule. So where you look at the current year and the preceding 2 calendar years to make the determination and add up to the 183 calendar days. So if you meet the test, assuming that you were here for 31 days during the calendar year and exceed the 183 days with the calculation, looking at the 3-year look back rule, then you're considered a resident alien for US tax purposes. If you don't meet the test, you are considered a non-resident alien for US tax purposes. However, there are also additional things to consider in this test, and some of it also relies on immigration status. Like, there's also the green card test. And so if you happen to have a permanent resident card at any point during the calendar year, this would actually impact the substantial presence test, because even if you wouldn't necessarily meet the residency requirements through the substantial presence test, if you have a permanent resident card in the year, you are automatically considered a resident alien for US tax purposes. Additionally, there's a special rule for F and J students. So students present in F1 or J1 status, or actually even it extends even to the dependents. You just have to be in an F or J status. You are exempt from counting the days you're present in this status for 5 calendar years. They don't have to be consecutive. So anytime you kind of have to keep track of when you've been here in either F or J status. But any part of those 5 calendar years where you're present, the days that you're present in the status won't count towards the test. This is why we see a lot of our F and J students, the first 5 years that they're present in the United States, they're usually filing as non-resident aliens. There's also a different kind of test for J1 scholars. So J1s, Js that are not students in counting days of presence, because then they have their days of presence in this status exempt from counting towards this test for 2 calendar years, including the current and the past 6 calendar years. So there's this kind of like a little more of a rotating basis. So your immigration history matters also, not just in this case for these exemptions for F and J status. You look back even beyond just the 3-year period that is usually looked at for the substantial presence test. So I mentioned, if you don't meet the substantial presence test, you're considered a non-resident alien for US tax purposes. What this means is you're only subject to US income tax on US source income, right? So usually, like if you're performing services here in the United States, that income is considered US source, and therefore, it would be reported to you, and then you would have to pay tax on it. Likewise, though, if you don't have to declare on your tax return income that you have earned in different countries if you're a non-resident alien. Non-resident aliens cannot file jointly with a spouse. So even if you are married, you will not be able to file jointly with another non-resident alien spouse. Usually also, you will not be able to claim dependents on your tax return. And you don't get to claim a deduction that is called the standard deduction on your tax return. So this is a big difference from if you were getting taxed as a resident alien. And that's why there's a different rate of tax withholdings for non-resident aliens versus resident aliens or US citizens. All right, and I'll go over, if you qualify as a resident alien or a US person, you would be subject to US income tax on your worldwide income. So not just what is sourced to the United States. But resident aliens are able to file as married and claim dependents, and they're also able to claim the standard deduction. So to give you kind of an example, for 2023, the standard deduction for someone filing as single was $13,850. So if you're married and filing separate or jointly, 27,700 for joint filers. So the reason I put these numbers in here, it kind of lets you see the impact. It's really important that you file the correct tax return because there are different rules that apply to each status and each tax return. And if you file the incorrect tax return, you might end up not paying the correct amount of tax. So it's always important to do your research, kind of determine, the substantial presence test, and make sure that you're filing the correct form. So here's another question that we get a lot is about tax treaty. So international students are required to pay federal, state, and county income taxes unless there's a tax treaty between the U.S. and their country of residence, and you're eligible for an exemption. So treaty exemptions may be claimed in two ways, right? You can apply for an exemption from tax withholding. And in this case, you would submit either Form 8233 if you're a non-resident alien, or Form W9 if you're a resident alien, to the tax department. This, after we review it and if it's approved, this will actually stop the withholding of taxes of federal, state, and county income tax for the benefit. So, to give an example, China has a tax treaty with the United States, and the student article in this treaty allows for $5,000 of U.S. source income to not be subject to U.S. income tax. So if a student submits this Form 8233 to our department, they're able to not get taxed on those $5,000 of income that they earn. Now, once the $5,000 limit of this exemption is reached, we go back to withholding taxes as usual. So I found that some students like the ability of claiming this treaty ahead of time before filing their tax return. So it just helps them, kind of level out their cash flow during the year instead of having to wait until the end. Some things to note about this is that in this case, if you submit Form 8233 to our department, you will expect to receive both a Form W2, which will report whatever income was taxed during the year, and then you also should expect to receive a Form 1042-S that then would report the amount of income that was exempted due to the treaty. In order to apply and submit Form 8233 to our department, you need a U.S. Social Security number in order to apply. So sometimes when students first come in, they're not able to take advantage of this exemption from tax withholding because they still don't have a Social Security number. But once you obtain that Social Security number and you have provided it to either the registrar's office or the Office of Human Resources, then you should be able to submit this form and to our department and we can process it. Additionally, to note is that the Form 8233 or Form W9 is only good for the calendar year it's submitted for. So you would probably, if you want to receive this benefit for more than one calendar year, you will need to continue submitting it each calendar year you wish to receive this benefit. So that was the first way to claim this exemption from tax, an exemption from tax withholding. The second way that you can claim this treaty benefit, say you didn't get your Social Security number in time and you ended up getting all your income reported on Form W2, it was all taxed, then you can claim it in your tax return. And so basically in this way, you're withheld as normal during the calendar year, and then you can claim the treaty benefit in your U.S. income tax returns, and then you would usually receive a tax refund with any excess withholdings due to the treaty. So now I'm going to cover the resources available for tax preparation. So as I mentioned, if you are a non-resident alien without any income sourced to the United States, you would only need to file Form 8848. The resources that we have available for this form is There are some form instructions available on the ISSA website. Additionally, Sprintax will also prepare this form if you wish to have a little more. If you're not comfortable working on the PDF yourself, then you can also just fill out this form on Sprintax. The way it works is just like a question and answer format, and it will help you complete the form. I don't believe that you're able to e-file this form, so you usually will have to print it out and send it in the mail. You do not need a U.S. Social Security number or ITIN to file Form 8843. So if you're a non-resident alien and you did have income, U.S. source income for the calendar year, whereas you received a Form W-2 or Form 1042-S or both, you will probably need to file Form 1040-NR. You may notice, if you had started doing your research before this presentation, a lot of the big tax preparation softwares you see advertised on TV or the internet don't prepare this form. It's actually just very small subset of resources available for the preparation of non-resident income tax returns. So ISSA has kindly made access to Sprintax available. They've made a code. They usually have a code for free federal tax preparation and a $5 discount for state tax preparation. Additionally, if you don't like Sprintax or decide to do something else, there is a second tax preparation software called Glacier Tax Prep. I think other universities have used it. Some people who transfer from other universities have kind of mentioned it before. You're free to use whatever tax preparation software you're comfortable with. Just make sure that it's a tax preparation software that is geared towards non-resident alien returns. And then if you are a resident alien with U.S. income, then you would file Form 1040. And then you're free to use any tax preparation software or tax preparer of your choice. So TurboTax, TaxAct, HR Block, or any your local CPA should be able to complete these tax forms. As an additional resource on campus, our tax department, we don't prepare personal income taxes, or we can also provide personal income tax advice. However, as the withholding agent, we do request more information to be able to ensure we can determine your status for U.S. tax purposes. So you may have already received from our department a request to complete an FNIS profile and submit some documents to our department. This information allows us to make a determination on whether you will qualify as a resident alien or non-resident alien for U.S. tax purposes, and then make sure that the payments you are receiving, either if they're from your department or through payroll, that they're being subject to the appropriate tax withholding in accordance to your status for U.S. tax purposes. So if you have any questions, if you have not received this request and you are receiving income from the university, make sure you can reach out to us at fntax@nd.edu, and we will activate your FNIS account, and you will receive a request for information from this email address. And now we'll cover this question that we get a lot: do I need an ITIN? So if you have a Social Security number, you will use your U.S. Social Security number in your tax filings, not an ITIN. So you will not need an ITIN if you already have a U.S. Social Security number. If you are eligible for a Social Security number, that is, sometimes if you're an F1 student and you have on-campus employment, you should apply for a Social Security number and not an ITIN. If you're eligible for a Social Security number, you're not eligible for an ITIN. Students and scholars who are not eligible for an ITIN and are filing a Form 1040-NR, yes, then you absolutely need to apply for an ITIN. If you're just filing a Form 8843, you do not need an ITIN. And if you're a resident alien and you're deciding to file jointly with your spouse, then in that case, your spouse will need an ITIN. So how do you apply for an ITIN? If at this point you do not have an ITIN, it's probably easier to just apply for an ITIN with your income tax returns. So the first step that you will do is you'll prepare your tax form, and then you can also prepare Form W-7. Once you have prepared your tax forms and prepared Form W-7, you can either make an appointment with the IRS Taxpayer Assistance Center, or even you can make an appointment with myself, and we will certify copies of your documents. This will then allow you to not have to send all the originals to the Internal Revenue Service. Usually what we require is your passport. We'll need your I-20 or your DS 2019, your visa, and your most recent I-94 record. You might also need to request an ISSA certification letter via ISSA link. And then once we have prepared all these documents, we have certified your returns, then we mail your ITIN application along with your original tax return to the Internal Revenue Service. We'll send it to the address on the Form W-7 instructions, and then first the Internal Revenue Service will provide you with an ITIN number. You'll receive a letter from the Internal Revenue Service letting you know what your ITIN number is. You should keep this letter in a safe space and make sure you have it accessible, because you will need this number in future tax years. And then once they assign you an ITIN, then they will they'll send over your tax return for processing. So usually when you have to apply for an ITIN, you can expect that the tax processing will take a little longer. So if you're expecting a tax refund from the Internal Revenue Service, it might be a while until you see that money actually deposited in your account. But I just wanted to let you know that it's perfectly normal. It's just part of this process. It's going through several levels of review. But I have heard from students, they do eventually get their refunds back, and then they have their ITINs for future years. And then it makes it much easier. Once you have an ITIN, you're actually able to e-file with the ITIN, similar to a Social Security number. So what if you can't complete your return on time and you need additional time to prepare your return? So, it's April 14th and you still think you have additional tax documents that you need in order to file a correct return. You can file Form 4868 to apply for a 6-month extension to file your tax return. You can kind of complete it. I kind of laid out a little bit on this slide on how you can complete it. If you still don't have if you are requesting an ITIN and don't yet have one, where it says on box 2 where it says your Social Security number, you can write in ITIN to be requested. Or if you're waiting to apply for a Social Security number, you can write in SSN applied for in that box. Just lets them know that you're waiting on some information. However, I will note that if you file this extension, it's only an extension for time to file. So if you actually end up owing tax, it wouldn't extend the time you need to pay, the time to pay the tax. So if you do not submit, if you expect to owe tax and you don't submit payment with this form, what's going to happen is you're going to be assessed a late payment, like a late payment penalty tax, and maybe some interest and other fees. So just something to keep in mind, that if you expect to owe, you probably want to file on time, or at least send in a payment before April 15th. Otherwise, you'd be considered a late payment. And with that, we can open it up to some questions.
Concha, we have a lot of questions and they're all really good. You guys, thanks so much. A lot of your questions are very general, and even if you feel like it's specific to your situation, there actually will be helpful, I think, for other students. The first part, I just wanted to give a couple of scenarios, Concha, and ask you to talk to them very specifically of, I think if you go back to one of your first slides, about which forms to file. So just to put it in slightly different language, because we had a couple of questions like this. So if a student did not work in the US, I think it's number 7.
Thank you.
The common tax forms, yeah. If a student did not work in the US but has a tuition scholarship, which tax form would they file?
So if it's just tuition, and not room and board, just then you would just file Form 8843. But
Okay.
in this case, if you're not sure about if it's just tuition or not, I would wait until the end of February to make that determination, because you may be receiving, if you did receive a scholarship for room and board, you would be receiving a Form 1042S. So, I would just kind of wait before filing it and just make sure, if you get a Form 1042S, then you probably would have to file Form 1040NR.
Okay. And that was the second one, is they didn't work in the US, but they did have a room and board scholarship. Then it would be the 1040NR. So you anticipated that scenario. And then if a student does have an on-campus job or assistantship and tuition scholarship, then what form are they using?
So then, you have a Form W-2, you'll have to use Form 1040NR to report that employment income.
Okay. A student asked when they will receive the 1042S, and I think you just answered that. It sounds like most of them have not been distributed yet, correct?
That's correct. So the Internal Revenue Service actually provides us, or, the preparer of the forms, up until March 15th to prepare these forms. We try to get them done as soon as we can, but there's a lot of manual work that goes into these. But we are expecting to have these out by February 20th. That's when we expect to mail it, the day after President's Day. So, you should not, so if you haven't received it already, that's okay. We haven't sent them yet. And actually, at this point in time, we cannot even confirm whether or not a student is going to receive one ahead of time, because we're still receiving information from the departments. So,
Great.
Just give us a couple more weeks. You can start, definitely for sure, can start gathering all the information that you're going to need to file your tax returns. But even if it's just like Form 1042S, you just want to make sure you have all the documents before you file your tax return. So just I would just recommend give it a little time, wait until the end of February to file, just to make sure that you have all the information, all the documents that you need to make sure the information you're filing is complete.
Great. And we will send out a reminder email on probably between March 1st and March 5th, reminding students to check their university systems for any additional tax documents that they might need, including the 1042S. So that's great. There are a couple of questions about, actually, I'll start with this one. If you don't have an SSN, but you did work in 2023, and now you are not working, how do you file your taxes? So you didn't get the SSN when you were working, and now it's time to file taxes. You don't have a job. What's the best strategy for filing the taxes?
All right. So there are two things that you can do in this scenario. The first one, since you're no longer eligible for a Social Security number, if you're going to apply for an ITIN with a Form W-2 included with your return, the Internal Revenue is going to ask questions. So you're going to actually need to apply with the Social Security office to receive a Social Security number ineligibility letter, or letter of ineligibility. And you're going to have to include that with the ITIN, along with all the other documents for the ITIN application. And even then, I have sometimes seen the IRS kind of come back and question it. They do not like it when this happens. So, if you're working, make sure you apply for that Social Security number. So another scenario that I would ask the student to consider is maybe they would want to start getting an on-campus job just so that they become eligible for the Social Security number again, maybe get a job that's, if you don't have a lot of time to commit, maybe get a job that doesn't require a lot of hours a week. And then that will make you eligible for a social security number. And you can apply for a social security number then. You still have a lot of time before April 15th. So that would give you plenty of time to get a social security number and get that W-2 corrected to have that social security number for 2023. Just because
Great.
it will take a long time to apply for that I-10.
Yeah, no, that's great. And we get that question all the time. And so it's just important for students to understand if you don't currently have a job, you cannot apply for the SSN. So you have to be currently employed at the time that you apply for the SSN to be eligible. So that just comes up a lot. We had a couple questions about deductions. So one student was asking about whether their stipends can be deducted or their room and board or their books. Do they get any of those educational or lifetime learning credits if they are filing as a non-resident alien?
What I have found is that non-resident aliens usually don't have these credits available to them. Yeah, I think that it is a little bit more limited, but again, I think on the upside is, you're only limited to getting taxed on that US income.
Okay. Similarly, just student received a form from Aetna Insurance confirming that they have health insurance. I think you referenced that form. What do they do with that form from their health insurance company when they're filing their taxes?
I would just recommend keep it in your files, but you do not have to file it with your tax return.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. We have a student who's asking, and I could answer this, but I'll let you. If they don't have a job currently, and they didn't have one last year, but they do plan to get a job, what form should they fill out in spring 2024? So they did not have a job in 2023, but they're planning on getting one soon.
All right, so I would just ask them. So I think I will answer this in two parts. So what form you need to file will depend on whether you had income. So even if you didn't work in 2023, if you will have a taxable scholarship, like say a room and board scholarship, or you received an award during the 2023 calendar year, then you would need to apply for a Form 1040-NR. If you had no U.S. source income, then you would file Form 8843. And if you are filing a Form 1040-NR and you still don't have a social security number by the time you didn't start your job, you weren't social security number eligible by the time you're preparing the return right before April 15th, then that means that sorry, I got a little distracted by the chat. But if you didn't get your SSN before the tax filing deadline, then that means you're probably going to have to apply for an I-10 even though you're still planning to work. Once you do get, you're going to have to apply for an I-10, and then once you do get your social security number, you would use the social security number instead of the I-10. So it'll just be a timing issue. It'll depend on what you use, what tax ID you'll need for your Form 1040-NR.
Great. A student, and this applies to a lot of our students who did internships outside of Indiana last year. If I did an internship in New York City and have a W-2 from my employer, do I pay New York state tax or Indiana state tax?
Ooh. So I think you will probably, in my experience, I don't know, every state is different. So it's just like you kind of have to look, and you're going to have to look at that specific state. But I think that a lot of states have sourcing for non-residents. So if you earned the income in New York State, then you will likely have to file, you will probably have been withheld New York State income taxes. You can check your W-2 and you'll see, there's a specific box that says what state, it specifies what state the withholding corresponds to. And then you'll only get that credit for that state. So you probably would want to prepare that tax return and file it just in case you can get any money back. But usually a lot of states do require you to file a tax return if you have income sourced to the state, similar to how Indiana does. So obviously it depends on every state. So I hate to kind of generalize, but usually I would recommend, you lose nothing by kind of like glancing at the form instructions and seeing whether or not you need to prepare a tax return. But when in doubt, file a tax return.
Yeah. And I'll say Sprint Tax, if you're using Sprint Tax to prepare your taxes, it will allow you to prepare the state taxes for any state. So for example, Florida doesn't have an income tax, a state income tax, so you wouldn't need to prepare there. New York might, but Sprint Tax can help you answer those questions about whether you need to file for a particular state based on the tax documents that you provide to them. A student, there's a couple of related questions, and this is going to be a repeat. A student just asked to clarify that 1042S, and then I have another student who has asked, do students who have room and board covered by financial aid, is that room and board taxed?
Yes. So, okay, so let me go back to the first question. That was just more an explanation of 1042S.
Yeah, because I think that's what documents it. Yeah.
Yes. So Form 1042S. Let me see. I think Form 1042S is basically reporting any income to a non-resident alien that's not employment income. And in my experience here at the university, the cases where we do see Form 1042S is if you applied for a treaty with our department, you submitted Form 8233 or Form W9 to the tax department to make, take advantage of a treaty exemption. If you did that, then you for sure will receive a Form 1042S that will, be claiming the amount. It will be reporting the amount of tax benefit you received. Additionally, if you have any scholarships that cover any room and board, or any awards that you may have received from your department, or any other type of financial aid that just is not towards tuition, would be reported on this Form 1042S. And then going on to the other question is, tuition scholarships are not reported on Form 1042S. And that's because the IRS has deemed that qualified tuition and expenses are not taxable. And so we don't report it, but anything that you may receive that is an excess of tuition or that is used, for something that is not for qualified tuition, like transportation, or books, those would be reportable. And a lot of times these items are subject to tax withholding at the source. So there's about a 14% federal tax withholding that applies to these types of payments. And a lot of times our students don't even see that because, like if you're receiving a room and board scholarship, it's not like the university gives you funds to pay for the room and board. They just apply it to your student account. So you never see the money and there will be no way for us to withhold. So the Office of Financial Aid here at Notre Dame is amazing. And really you should thank those guys every day. They just do such great work. But they actually are grossing up. So they are covering the tax withholding associated with the room and board scholarships. So if you're receiving a room and board scholarship, you'll see that your 1042S is stating the income, and is actually stating an income that's a little higher than the room and board amount that's being covered. And that's because it also is covering, it's adding up what they're covering for taxes. So what you end up receiving on your student account is net of all the withholding. So they already kind of help you so that you don't have a large tax liability due with your tax return as a result of getting the scholarship. So that's really nice. And so that's something that you can kind of take a little breath, like, okay, yeah, it'll be reported, but you know, the tax is already kind of prepaid on your behalf for that amount. So
Great.
that's it for the room and board. It's yeah.
Great. We have two questions about dependents. The first one is, does a spouse with an F2 visa, which means they cannot work in the US, they're not eligible to work in the US, do they need to file tax documents? And if yes, what documents as a dependent who is not working?
So that's a really great question because I have seen that a lot. So I've seen that before also, and I'm glad because I did not mention that. So your dependents, if they're non-resident aliens, will just need to file Form 8843. That would they're just letting the IRS know that they're here on that J status and they're exempt from counting towards tax residency. As again, it's just an informational form. But they don't, you know, they don't need to file a Form 1040 NR, especially if they don't have any income. But usually they are also supposed to file Form 8843.
Okay. And then the second question about dependents is actually less a dependent, more a spouse. So I'm assuming the student who asked this question is a non-resident alien, but their spouse is a legal permanent resident and is claiming their children as dependents. Can they still file jointly, even though one would be filing as a non-resident and one would be filing as a resident?
So if you file jointly, I think that non-resident aliens do have the ability to file jointly with a resident alien spouse. So usually you'll be, the resident alien will be like the main tax preparer and then add on the spouse. You know, I would suggest in this situation, then you probably want to work with the spouse who is the legal permanent resident and their tax preparer to hone out all the details. But I will say that in those cases, like usually as a withholding agent, just like as an aside, because sometimes it kind of comes as a surprise. But when you're prepaying the tax, you know, with your tax withholding, we're still going to treat you as a non-resident alien. So even if you're filing jointly with the resident alien spouse, your resident alien spouse can claim the status of married on their tax withholding elections, but you will not. And that's only because in the case of after the year end, if you decide to file separate, you know, your withholdings are still covering your income. So that's, you know, that's just the way the instructions are for non-resident aliens for tax withholding. So even though then you end up filing together, you just won't be able to change those withholding elections on Inside ND.
I knew that was a little more specific, but I also suspect there's a lot of students who have maybe different statuses in their family. So wanted to be sure to ask. I think this was the same student, but there's questions about dividend income. I don't know if you feel comfortable speaking to this. One was based on US sourced dividend income. Do they need to file that 1040 based on that kind of income? Or is that back to the non-employment based? And so that they'll give them a 1042-S, they file with the instructions.
So sometimes for dividend income, they'll provide a 1099 DIV. You know, if you receive that form 1099, I would suggest, yes, go ahead and file. That is US source income. So it just, you know, usually if you'll receive the tax form, usually.
Yeah. And then a student had a question similarly, but it was about having non-US source dividends, or in this case, I think it was Canadian. But if students are receiving payment from outside the US for work that they're doing, we would of course discourage students not to do any unauthorized work while they're in the US. But if they were getting dividend income, any income from a non-US source, would they need to include that on their US tax documents?
So I guess that would depend if they're filing as a resident alien or non-resident alien, right? So non-resident aliens is only subject to US income tax and US source income. But I will add that if you have been performing services, even from like a company that is abroad, but you've been performing services in the US, usually income for services performed for US tax laws, it's sourced where the service is being performed, not where the payor is, is set. So that's just something to consider. But if you're filing as a resident alien, then you would likely have to include all income from any, not just U.S. sources on that tax return.
Okay, thank you. A couple students asked about tax treaties, and one of the students referenced the Notre Dame website. I don't think this is an ISSA website, but that their tax treaty between their country and the U.S. is not listed on the Notre Dame website. And so what do they do if it's not listed?
If it's not listed, usually it's just, we try to usually, I think there's only been one case where I think it hasn't been listed. If you think that there is an applicable treaty article from that treaty, feel free to email fntax@nd.edu. You can complete a Form 8233 or Form W9, whatever applies, and then we'll let you know about your, that specific country for that specific treaty article. We'll let you know if there's something available.
Great. There was a question about, I think we probably have 8 more questions, so we're getting to the end of them. You're doing great. The student is in their 6th year with an F1 visa, and we do have students who did their undergrad and a master's in the US. They do their master's and then a PhD, so there's probably other students with this question. Would they, if they have been in the US as an F1 for 6 years, are they a resident alien now?
So I guess it just depends. Is this their 6th year, or was last year their 6th year? So
perfect. Yeah.
You want to know if 2023, you're looking at the 2023 calendar year for these tax returns. So you're going to file based on the determination on your 2023 calendar year. Whatever I always recommend to anyone who's asking what's my status, I'm like, if you're not sure, start with Sprint Tax. Sprint Tax has this amazing feature. It'll ask you for your entire immigration history. You'll complete that section, and then it'll let you know, okay, you're a non-resident alien, or no, you're a resident alien. You need to go file somewhere else. So I think that if you don't know where to start with Sprint Tax. You want to get this right. As I mentioned, the differences between filing as a resident alien and a non-resident alien are a lot, and you want to make sure that you file correctly. So it's even free. So it's really like there's no charge to do this. So you create the account, and then you go through the steps of that substantial presence test. It's like part of the intake, and then Sprint Tax itself will let you know how, whether or not they can help you or not. So that's where I would suggest to begin if you don't know.
Awesome. And absolutely, totally agree with that. There's a couple of questions that I actually think will also be relevant. They're going to sound specific, but I think they'll be relevant for a lot of students, because we've gotten this question a number of times where students have initiated the process with Sprint Tax, and they are surprised by either how much tax they owe or how much tax refund they get. And I wonder if I could probably give one example where I think probably a student got a higher refund than they're expecting. And you can correct me if this is, if I'm wrong. And that might be that they hadn't actually reported their social security number when they first started getting paid at the beginning of their program, or they hadn't filed the right tax documents. And if they did that mid-semester, then more money would have been withheld at the beginning of the semester. And then it was adjusted mid-semester. And that might be why they have a higher than expected refund. So I could see that being a scenario. I don't know if that sounds true to you.
So
or how does that work?
So it just depends. So for non-resident aliens, unfortunately, I hate giving this call, and we do try, to request those documents through FNIS and try to help out, because if we find out that you're a non-resident alien and you're not being withheld at the non-resident alien rate every paycheck, going back to this diagram, we try to adjust it so that you are getting withheld. And then I get a lot of questions like, well, why now is my my pay is lower, and I'll have to explain like, hey, you're a non-resident alien, and if you don't withhold at this rate, you're gonna be, you're gonna owe a lot of money. So we're trying to help you out. But sometimes we don't have those documents to make those determinations, or sometimes we can't process them all fast enough. So sometimes when you come in the fall, we don't have them done until the end of the semester, and we just load, we will make the changes for the next calendar year. So I get a lot of questions, a lot of non-resident aliens, when they're withheld at the rate for resident aliens, they do find that then they have to pay a lot at the time of tax, filing their tax returns. And that's only, sometimes they're like, well, is there a mistake? Or, and it's just like, well, unfortunately, the mistake was done on step one, right? We didn't adjust that tax withholding. And so
immediately,
it didn't reflect how you're going to file your tax return. And if, we go back, that standard deduction is a big number, right? It's $13,000 of your income that didn't get withheld, because it was assumed that you were going to get this deduction. But if you don't end up getting that deduction, you're basically adding, the tax for those $13,850 that you're going to have to come up with at the end. What we can do is we can try to correct it for 2024. As I said, like step 3, you make those adjustments so it doesn't happen again. But I know it's a difficult situation to be in. And now I don't usually see the opposite too much of non-resident aliens being withheld too much tax. However, I would expect it if they have a treaty. So if they're claiming a tax treaty, I would expect that that number to be a lot higher, because some tax treaties can cover up to $5,000 of income.
Okay. No, that's helpful. So my example was the complete opposite. If that was the situation, then someone would be being withheld at a lower rate. If they get their tax documents in place, then there's a higher rate, maybe higher pay in the spring, that first spring. And then maybe the student who's referencing a higher refund, maybe they have a tax treaty and and that's what's impacting. So just the general note you're saying, Concha, is that there's a lot of factors in this. And each student has an individual situation. We get a lot of students who say, I'm talking to all my collaborators in the lab and they all are paying way less in taxes than I am. And you should always investigate that, but it doesn't always mean that there's a mistake. It means that you have a very particular situation with the US government and withholding taxes. So always ask questions, but just know that most likely that the government generally has it right. Also when they're figuring that out.
Yeah, I echo that though. I think a lot of times we fall into like we're comparing, but some different countries have different different treaties. So I actually forgot to mention, but there is a special case for non-resident aliens. How it's here, it says generally cannot claim the standard deduction. Well, F1 students from India, they actually are, like, I think the only exception, I think, to this rule of the standard deduction, but they can file as non-resident aliens and get the standard deduction on their tax return. So if you're comparing yourself with an F1 student from India, like, it's going to be a different situation. And actually, now that I think about it, that would be another case. That would be the one case I could think about, but a non-resident alien who probably was being withheld at the non-resident alien rate, but then maybe we got their documents and found that they were from India and then would qualify for the standard deduction. So then probably would get a larger refund.
Yeah, that's a great example, just because of the differences. I know that we are at time, and so I'm just going to look for a couple more questions and make sure that I've got all of the main ones. If we have not answered your question, you can certainly email Concha, or you can email us, and we'll connect with Concha and make sure that you have what you need. Dulce, you might see one or two that I also haven't seen. I see one, so please jump in and stop me. There's one that says that wants to confirm there are 3 different filings for federal, state, and county taxes. How many times are they mailing off something to the government, either the state or the US government? And I can say, at least in Indiana, county taxes are done with your state taxes. So you are only going to mail off one set of documents to the Indiana Department of Revenue. And they will do both the county and the state in that same set of documents. So in Indiana, if you only have Indiana income, you would do federal and Indiana state.
Yes, I would agree with that. So, you would do your federal return, and then, again, it would depend too on like if you did an internship abroad, like it just depends on how many states you're going to have to file. But usually, most students are usually just have a federal and an Indiana return. So
yeah. I think this is also maybe true. We've gotten a couple of emails and it's less applicable to 2023 taxes, but there is an email about in January, the tax for a number of students have reached out and said that their taxes that were deducted in January were higher than they were last year. Would that be based on the example that you gave earlier that maybe their FNIS just got updated and so they're going to see that change for 2024, but then in 2025 they will not owe as much? Is that what that probably is?
that's correct. So usually if you saw changes to your withholdings, it's probably because we finally were able to catch up and process the FNIS documents that you submitted last fall. And we made it effective like the 1st of January. So then, hopefully then you will have been withholding correctly for January, not correctly, but in accordance with how you're going to file, so that, there's not a large gap between, what you're paying in federal tax withholdings and what you're going to owe when you file your tax return.
Great. I think, Dulce, I'm not sure if you're seeing any others. I'll turn it back to you. I'm not seeing any questions that I've missed that maybe aren't super specific.
No, Lee, I think you covered a lot of them. So a lot of them are pretty specific. I just want to echo the Concha mentioned about spring checks, and there have been questions that have come our way, and I have literally just gone to Spring Check's blog and searched that specific question, and Spring Check has dedicated a lot of time and effort to giving you the answer to those questions. So I know sometimes we direct students to contact Spring Check, but the answers, some of the answers really are there. So that just want to echo that about spring checks.
I will add that the chat feature is also pretty good. And I've worked side by side with some students trying to get that chat feature, and like I'm just amazed sometimes at just how
intuitive it is. Like it knows what you're thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So if we don't have any more questions, and it sounds like feel free to send us your questions, like Leah said, or send them to Concha. If there's no other questions, then Concha, thank you so much for being here with us and helping answer some questions and really helping to provide some general information about our students. To our students, just note that our website does have a lot of this information there. And links that link out to all the appropriate departments and all the appropriate places where you might need to gather forms from or anything like that. And as always, we're here to help you. And let us know if you have any other questions. Email us, visit us virtually, or our email Concha. If nothing else, then we'll wrap it up. Thank you guys so much. Have a good night. Get some rest. It's almost the weekend.